Tim Bowden here with the Social History feature and the fourth program in the Maritime Australia series. We go in quest of the sea snail, or abalone, now a multi-million-dollar export industry for Australia.
When we first started, all our abalone was shelled. There was no limits. In the early days there was no compressors, then we went on to compressors a few years later. The market side of it, you didn't know where you were from one day to the next. Everything was uncertain. Today, we work out of bigger boats. We use compressed air. We have a 10-tonne quota per year. We're not allowed to shell fish anywhere but registered premises.
Our sport became our job. I see it as doing your hobby or your interest and getting paid for it as well.
Only 30 years ago, abalone fishing was an amateur affair where divers operated as individuals and sold their catch where they could, very often to supplement other income. However, it soon became apparent that there was a living to be made if the marketing was organised properly. So abalone fishermen set about building a well-controlled and highly efficient modern industry. It's now a long way from the abundant supply and easy lifestyle of the 60s.
In the early days down around Victoria, there was really nice scenery, a lot of sponges and long kelps and unusual fish. It was very adventurous. Every time we'd dive, it'd be a new adventure, and a lot of times you'd stop and have a good look around. And the earlier days when I went down around Conron and that, it was amazing because there was lobsters everywhere. There was the Tasmanian red lobster. They were in abundance, and we could get as many as we wanted to. But I've seen lobsters, whiskers as far as you can see underwater. And in those days, they were worth about 35 cents a pound, and abalone were worth 43, so we never used to worry about lobsters.
When I started, everybody told me that I'd be one of the people who wandered around Port MacDonald with no fingers on my hand because they'd all got eaten off by conger eels, or what they have. Moray eels are more tropical. And the southeasters got an enormous number of crayfish in very shallow water, and these stories abounded where people had sort of snorkeled in the early days and put their hands under rocks to grab crayfish, and a conger eel had bitten them off. But I think in the first 12 months I didn't see a conger eel, and so gradually forgot about them, and it wasn't until about 2 years later when I was diving on compressed air in the southeast that I one day looked under a rock ledge and sort of saw a fish shape that I didn't really recognise, and it suddenly dawned on me that this was a conger eel, and the thing was thicker round than my thigh is, and I sort of looked at my hands and made sure that I still had all my fingers.
In the early part, we just used snorkel, mask, fins and a wetsuit. And as we got rolling and got a little bit more money, we acquired compressors and boats and sort of built up to what we are today.
To keep warm under the water, we used to buy disposal store army jumpers, and we used to sew the neck up on the army jumper and put both our feet into the arms of the army jumper and pull the base of the jumper up around our shoulders and strap them up. And then the other jumper we'd put on the top of that.
We'd dive down, chip them off and bring them up, and we had car tubes with a net bag hanging in them that we used to throw them in. And when that was filled up, we'd pull it to the boat, and then the deckhand in the boat would pull it on board and shell them out, shell them into bins. There was always someone in the boat, mainly because the weight that we used to catch in those days, if you had it all in the shell, the boat would sink.
The sorts of things that would give you great trouble is if you had a bag of abalone that was sort of 3/4 full, and we used a canvas bag over the top, a parachute to lift it, and you didn't really have enough air in the parachute to give you much assistance, and you sort of had to make this decision whether you free ascended on your own, which was simple, or you took what at the time was perhaps $60 worth of abalone with you, which was going to be one hell of a bloody struggle. And there were numerous occasions where halfway up you'd realise that you'd made the wrong decision, so you had to let go of the bag, but you were very reluctant to. And I can remember lots of occasions being on the surface actually sort of saying, well, I've got it here, I'm not going to let go of it now, but still not being able to get a breath because the waves were knocking you around and the bag was dragging you under and you really couldn't swim hard enough to get above the waves.
We were one of the early ones that started up with the hooker system, Prior to that, the first time we ever dived for abalone was with a big CIG bottle of compressed air. And we used to have 2 hoses up running off that, and they were 60 foot long. But it was too cumbersome in ours because we only had small boats. 14-foot Quintrex was a popular boat at that time. And with the big CIG bottle, it was too heavy. So we went back to the drawing board. Some of the setups, when I think back, were probably fairly toxic. Actually, the first compressor I ever used, we ran it on engine oil, which is taboo, which is poison, and we didn't know any difference. We thought, it's pumping air, that's the main thing.
Scuba tanks weren't as common because you just ran out of air too quickly. It's physically hard work, and if you're down for a while, you'd breathe a tank down in about 10 or 15 minutes, so you just have to carry too many of them. The standard rig was a little Honda motor connected to a 2 or 4 cylinder compressor that would pump about enough air for 3 divers working on the bottom in shallow water, only one diver down to about 80 or 90 feet. From that compressor there was a short hose or a copper coil which cooled the air down, and it went into an air reserve. The air being cool, the oil then condensed out of it, dropped to the bottom of the reserve, and there was a blowout which got rid of most of the oil. The next stage in the system was a filter to filter out any remaining oil because the moisture had been blown off. Then there was a long hose connected to the filter. It floated on the surface, so it didn't get tangled up in rocks and weed and things. And then from the surface it ran down to the diver. The hose was tucked under his weight belt, and then in the end of that was plugged a demand valve, a downstream demand valve, so that as you sucked on the thing it released air to you. The compressors only pumped about 100 psi or less. You couldn't work deeper than about 100 feet unless you bumped up the pressure, but most abalone's in between 5 and 50 feet.
When we started on compressed air, it made a difference to the bottom, mainly because there was no size limits in those days. It was an open fishery and there was no restrictions. You were allowed to take fish from the biggest down to the smallest that you could find, so it had a big effect in the early days on the industry.
Developments in breathing gear allowed the divers to stay down longer and gather more abalone, and the aluminium dinghy encouraged exploration further afield. In the dangerous waters around Tasmania, abalone fishermen take unbelievable risks in small fiberglass and metal boats. As one diver commented, "You can't see a diver sweat beneath his wetsuit." The New South Wales coast is a little more benign, but the sea is never predictable.
Just last year I lost a boat. Just happened to miss, parked on a spot. It was flat calm, and next minute a big wave came and swamped the boat. I went over with the boat. I got clear of the boat, and offside he ended up under the boat with all the hoses, and when the boat was upside down he came up inside the boat and he got tangled up in them amongst the hoses, but he was in an air pocket, and he came up and he was panicking a bit, and then I said, leave the boat alone, get away from the boat, and we swam towards the shore and climbed up on the shore and tried to rescue the boat, but we couldn't get it.
Once I went to work without my deckhand. I called in to pick him up and he was still drunk from the night before. So I went to work by myself. I put the anchor down and jumped in the water. In the boat I had my hooker unit, which is the motor and compressor that supplied my air supply. And I went to work, and after about half an hour in the water, it started to get hard to breathe, and I thought the compressor had stopped. So I popped up to the surface and looked over to where the boat should have been, and there was no boat. And the wind had changed direction and blown it around, and it had gone onto a bombora, and a wave had swamped it, and the boat was on the bottom.
The worst problem was getting in and out of the water in some of the areas that we worked. You sort of worked off rocky headlands and outcrops, and the entrance into the water wasn't particularly easy at many times, and coming back out of the water with a bag full of abalone and sort of trying not to lose that, you ended up getting sort of bashed against rocks and washed around quite frequently. And if you became quite adventuresome in terms of some of the more difficult areas which perhaps contained abalone that somebody else hadn't managed to reach, particularly on your own, it was always a hazard that maybe you were going to break a leg or get bashed up that badly that you weren't going to be able to get back out of the water.
One time I was diving in deep water. We dived 100 to 120 feet of water and run into decompression time very quick. I used to come up and move in a little bit shallower and decompress in shallower water. And this particular day I came out of 120 feet of water, moved into 80 feet, jumped back in the water, got to the bottom, and my deckhand ran over the hose and cut it, which left me on the bottom with no air and a free ascent and the bends. And there was no way around it. By the time we got the hose connected and I got in the water, it was too late. There was no recompression chamber in those days where we were at Eden at the time, and my wife spent the night standing on my wrists trying to ease the pain from the bends. The bends is nitrogen bubbles that form in your blood, and they accumulate around your joints, and when you come up from any depth, those bubbles expand with the drop in pressure, which causes pain in your joints, and any pressure you can apply to them eases the pain. And that's what she was doing, standing on my wrists.
Well, there's virtually no way to guard against bubbles forming in the blood because it happens almost on every dive, merely because you put your blood under pressure and then release it again when you come to the surface. It's like making soft drink, putting a cap in a bottle, then taking the cap off. In terms of alleviating the long-term damage, safe diving practice will minimise it, and you probably could be a commercial abalone diver and not suffer any long-term consequences that would be noticeably different from other people in the community. But there would have to be a fairly large abalone resource, and you would have to be able to dive fairly short periods infrequently. You certainly shouldn't be diving 3 days in a row, which all divers do from time to time. We had one diver who dived 70 days straight. That was unheard of in the industry. His nickname was Hungry. But even the average to below average diver would dive more than 3 days in a row. When the weather's good, you dive. So they'd do 4, 5, 6, 10 days straight. Your body starts to wear out after about 10 days of 5 or 6 hours in the water. But safe diving would mean not doing 5 or 6 hours in the water.
There were some days when nervousness would set in for some reason or another, and a hangover was a great predisposing sort of influence on nervousness. You wouldn't feel good being underwater, you wouldn't feel good being up at that time of the day anyway, and so you'd sort of start to look around, and the more you looked around, the more nervous you became. And I've had a few days when I've sort of got to the point where I've sat in the boat for 10 or 15 minutes and said to myself, well, either I've got to forget about it, there's nothing there, I've got to forget about it, or I might as well go home and have a day off.
It takes a certain sort of psyche to be a successful abalone diver. Carl Edmonds, one of the top diving medical people, was looking at that, and in fact he tried to get this survey of abalone divers going to do the neurological and psychological test, because the Navy were interested in what makes a good diver. If they could figure it out by psychological testing in advance, they would save a lot of training money on people who failed at the end of the process. So they could find out what makes a person who is able to go down in completely black water and grope around on the bottom and find bodies or take mines off ships or something. And abalone diving is almost the same, diving in rough, dirty water, going into caves, getting caught up in weed, that sort of thing.
I guess loneliness is one of the things that a diver puts up with. It's one of the few occupations I know of where you actually shut yourself away for 5 or 6 hours of the day and you can't even talk to yourself. If you can imagine locking yourself in a toilet, turning the lights out and throwing water all over your face, that's the sort of conditions that a diver puts up with. It takes a peculiar sort of person, I suppose, to do that for 5 or 6 hours a day. Some evenings sitting on the beach and the sort of sun going down, you're just sitting shelling abalone, you're absolutely dead tired, but totally at peace with the world because it's so peaceful and lovely.
Individualistic sort of people, so you can't put any sort of tag on them. A lot of them were spear fishermen. They just loved the ocean. A lot of them used to dive part-time from other jobs, and there were radio technicians, plumbers, ex-school teachers, service manager was one from an electrical organisation. Some of them were just fishermen who drifted from fishing into abalone. So it's a bit hard to say. Gregarious sort of people, they all had something to say for themselves. Not many of them were shy, retiring types. I mean, newspapers at the time called them hippies of the sea. I remember one quote was a ragtag bunch of drug-taking hippies.
In the early days, all the abalone divers and that were living in tents. If you had a caravan, you know, you're well off sort of thing. And the first impression I went to Connor on, there was probably about 20 or 30 divers camped in the camps, and at first we were a bit wary of the camp because of rough sort of a mob and everything like that. But after a while we got to know them, and it turned out they were all doing the same thing, and we all got on pretty well together.
The bulk of the divers in it in those days earned a lot of money and spent it as quick as they earned it, or quicker, I think, a lot of them. It was something that, as the price went up on the abalone, that you were making 3 and 4 times the wages a week that a person in a qualified job was making. So you had a lot of money at your disposal, and you spent it that way. In the early days, especially, there was a lifestyle. The divers used to move up and down the coast together, more or less, working the beds. The partying was pretty heavy, and drinking, and it could go on sometimes for 2 or 3 days, and then everyone had come to their senses a little bit and go to work to earn money for the next party. That's what a lot of it revolved around in those days, up until about 70 before the changes really started.
2 or 3 experiences of having spent a good night in the pub and then having to go to work the next day sort of led you to change your ways. A great deal of competition between the divers at the time, and if you came in on the beach with less than what sort of was the average, everybody would certainly let you know that, you know, you weren't performing too well. The whole town was interested in what was going on, and everybody's kids were interested in what was going on. And a typical example would be you'd come into the beach and you'd perhaps be a bit later than anybody else, and so there'd be this huge group of kids climb on the boat and look in, and they'd all say, you only got 200 pound, Blakey got 600 today, and so got so many. So you really felt really good after that little rubbishing. And I mean, there were lots of tales of the night we drank the Elliston pub dry of Bacardi, and tales of how you evaded the 10 o'clock closing rule or got some extra grog out of the pub and took it back to the caravan park. Fairly hard players in that sense. During times when it was rough, you'd do the cups of tea bit, sit around and just drink cups of tea and talk until it was time to perhaps have a drink, and then you'd have a few hours in the afternoon.
In the mid-1960s, some divers became concerned about the very obvious depletion of stocks and were even predicting that the abalone would soon become extinct. Governments were persuaded to recognise the value of the industry and to introduce licences and size limits to protect the livelihood of those involved.
When I first started, there was no such thing as licences or anything like that. They didn't recognise abalone as a fish. Then later on, in New South Wales, you had to get a licence, and it was a $2 licence. And then it went down to Victoria for a few years. There was no such thing as licences down there. You just went out and got it.
In New South Wales, they lobbied for the same management controls that were in other states. New South Wales, because of this biogeographic difference, where we had warm water, cold water, variable from year to year and season to season, we had the sort of fishing industry where fishermen had grown up with moving from one stock to another. They had to survive. And in the first days of abalone, or when we introduced licence limitation, more than 50% of the people who held licences at that time worked for 4 months of the year or less on abalone. So it was still basically a large component of part-time fishing in it.
I was combining working on the farm a little with my diving during that first year. And then the following summer, what happened was that they had introduced licensing in Victoria and New South Wales, and many of the divers who worked only during the summer or worked as sort of a social adjunct to whatever they were doing, they did it for pleasure, just to pay for their pleasure equipment, couldn't work in Victoria any longer because they had to have a restricted licence and they weren't available, so they came across the border. And we had in that summer in the southeast probably 500 or 600 Victorian divers, amateurs of all sort of shapes and sizes, camping out on beaches as clubs or as individuals, and they fairly well stripped the area, all the areas that they could reach with a snorkel.
To protect the industry, we had a fairly big fight with the New South Wales Fisheries Department on trying to get a size limit put on the ab so as to protect it, you know, because it had been open slather for so long that the beds were depleted. There was more or less nothing left. And then just out of the blue, we put on the old scale a 4-inch size limit, which in later years we increased, and now it's up into millimetres. It's 115 millimetres. So with that and the beds recovering, the co-op really started to kick off, with no help in those days from the fisheries. A group of New South Wales divers got together and formed the New South Wales Abalone Divers Co-op in a roundabout sort of a way. It wasn't called that then, but what we did, we all went to work, we pooled our abalone, and instead of selling to different buyers, we pooled it, froze it, and then offered it out as a lump to the highest bidder. And that's actually the way that the New South Wales Ab Divers Co-op kicked off. We had highs and troughs in the marketing side of it with the buyers we were selling to. If there was a hiccup in the market of 30 cents a kilo, it would have cost us $1, and because we had nowhere else to sell it, so we had to keep supplying, and the buyers didn't worry about how we were, just as long as they got their money. So we figured there had to be a better system, and we started pooling our ab and selling to the highest bidder. And at a later stage, probably 2 years later, the actual co-op was kicked off as the New South Wales Abalone Divers Cooperative. The department's idea was that the resource will look after itself and the strong will survive, and as far as the divers went. But it wasn't much of an industry then. You couldn't guarantee supply to the people you were selling to. It was just a jumbled up mess until we started to get organised.
We've regulated ourselves. A lot of people take it that we're regulating the people that are outside the abalone industry. We regulated ourselves to try and make an industry out of it, which isn't a good industry. It's an export industry. If we just dropped all those regulations, within 6 months there'd be no industry at all.
The bulk of our market at the moment is Japan. We sell frozen meat, fresh frozen on shell, parboiled on the shell, live into Japan. With the Eden factory coming online, it's going to be canned abalone as well now, so we'll have a full product range. So when there's hiccups in the market now, we can switch from, if we're doing cans and cans don't sell, we can go into fresh frozen or the parboiled product, and it makes it that way that you just haven't got all your eggs in the one basket. The divers' lifestyle's changed altogether now since I started. We have 18 and 19-year-olds coming in that have bought into the industry with help from their parents, and it's a different story altogether now. They're business people that are coming into the industry now. They have an investment and they like to protect it.
The situation nowadays is they've had to buy into the industry, and they're a different type of diver. They've got to try and earn an income to justify them buying into the industry. And basically, they're a business-minded type of person. If the price they paid for the licence just doesn't justify the quantity they're getting, well, they've got to get out of it and sell and put their dollar somewhere else. New South Wales is still the cheapest state to get into. We've got a 10-tonne quota at present. And as it is, I'm one of the original divers, and they've got a 2-to-1 system to try and reduce the divers. My licence is around about 250,000 to 300,000. But you've got to buy 2 licences to get in, so it probably costs you around about 600,000 to get into New South Wales, and it'll allow you 10 tonne. But if you wanted to get into any of the other states, I think Tasmania and Victoria, they're over $1 million, and some of their quotas around about 17 tonne to 20 tonne.
And the people who have come into the fishery are either businessmen in their own right, who have come in with a fair bit of capital and just see it as a good investment, and also like diving and can withstand the physical rigours involved. In a couple of cases, they are sons of existing abalone divers, but even there, they've seen a different sort of investment lifestyle, if you like, and a background. They've seen their fathers earn some money and invest it and pay off the house and do that sort of thing. So they're more financially aware, a bit more astute. The health aspects have been more to the fore, so they think about those these days. So it is a different calibre of young person. The gross income is about, in New South Wales with 10 tonne of quota, is about $160,000 or more. That represents about 75 to 100 days in the water at about 5 hours a day. So it's still not a bad lifestyle. It's not too much hard work. It's still not easy. The abalone still don't jump into the boat. but it's still almost unskilled or semi-skilled labour. In the early days, people put ads in the paper, abalone divers needed, and there's no doubt about it. They were thrown on a boat with a wetsuit and they took abalone and had catches next day, at least half as high as the long-time divers. So it's still only unskilled or semi-skilled work. So to be able to go out and earn $160,000 turnover in a business where you could do it for under $40,000 operating costs is not too bad. Now, the better operators, of course, use more skilled and experienced deckhands, and they use more comfortable and safer boats. So it costs a bit more, but it's still not a bad fishery to be in.
5 Australian states, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia, have abalone fisheries, but only in the last couple of years have governments begun to collect national figures. The number of people employed has not yet been collated, but it's known that the export industry is worth in excess of $110 million. Abalone fishermen are very conscious of preserving their livelihood.
The abalone were there. We thought they were going to all get cleaned out in 12 months. We didn't know any better. I think every diver thought that he only had 12 months of diving. And my objective when I first started diving was to work hard for 12 months and then go into some other fishery. But then the 12 months went past and I thought, oh, well, I'll keep diving till I'm 25. And then I reached 25 and I said I'd dive till I was 30. But I'm 46 now and I'm still going.
There was always this feeling in the industry that the next patch of abalone that you found might be the last one, because in those days we were continually working virtually virgin abalone beds, and when we went into an abalone bed that nobody had touched, they were a carpet of abalone where they were virtually touching one another. I can remember times when I'd swum over a piece of bottom and not seen any abalone, and then suddenly seen one, and you reach down and chip it off the bottom, and as you do, you realise that that thing that's got a piece of weed next to it that looked like a rock was another one. And perhaps 2 hours later, after you'd chiselled all them off, there was just a sheet of white limestone left.
The divers are in a unique position in the fishing industry in that they can see the damage they do when they actually do it. A normal fisherman, be it commercial or recreational, has to go back to a spot, fish hard and not catch any fish to realise there are none there. Abalone divers, when they leave a reef, have looked at what they've just taken and they know there are none left. They don't have to go back to have a bad day. So it's a unique position in fishing because they see what they take when they take it. Other fishermen are sort of fishing from a balloon through the clouds, if you like, and they don't know what they're leaving behind or what's there. So ab divers just woke up quicker because they could see it directly.
Abalone divers talking then about their experiences were Wes Weston, Carl Babington, Gary Hamer, Mike Vanderpeer and Barry McRoberts. Production assistants for this program, David Pullen and Alison Breen. Technical production, Janita Palmer and Russell Stapleton.
And that was the 4th program in the series Maritime Australia, produced and presented by Ros Bowden from the ABC's Radio National Social History Unit, with assistance from the Australian National Maritime Museum. In the next program, we follow the life story of a remarkable boat built to a column archer design in Sydney in the late 1930s, the Mystique of the Kathleen Gillet. Tim Bowden here with the Social History feature and part 5 of the 6-part series Maritime Australia. In this program we trace the life story of a remarkable boat, the Mystique of the Kathleen Gillet.
This story begins with Jack Earl, who in the 1930s was a young man working as a newspaper artist in Sydney. He was a keen sailor and an incurable romantic, and he had a vision, fed by the literature of the time, of a very special boat.
I guess it started a long time back. I used to read a fair bit in those days, and I read a book called The Dream Ship by a fellow called Ralph Stock many, many years ago, and he had a Colin Archer vessel, something like the Kathleen, and he sailed from across the Atlantic to the Panama and across the Pacific, and he sailed in the Friendly Islands. But it was a good story, and it sort of stuck in my mind, and I thought, gee, if I have a great ship, I'd go for one of those. Meantime, I'd been studying about Colin Archer and his great designs, and when the time came and I got married to Kath, we were both very aware of what our life was to be. It was to be on the water, and we were going to have one of those ships built instead of a house, of course. It's just a thing that had to happen, you know.
When Jack, of course, produced this wonderful boat, endless effort went into equipping the thing. Jack had high and romantic standards of what the yacht should be, and he had some very capable friends, and they gradually put together really a marvellous boat, not by any means gold-plated, but representing all sorts of amateur seamanship of a very high quality. So we all envied him, his yacht and his intentions. But in those days, at least, and perhaps now, only people like Jack Earl really get up and do it.
The Kathleen Gillet, built to a Colin Archer design, was launched in 1939, but it was far from finished. Jack and Kath lived on the boat and worked on it in their spare time. The boat continued to be their home after their children were born.
We were living on the boat as soon as he went in the water. And from 1939 till 1947, we were on the boat. For the whole time we were living aboard, the 8 years I was working on her. To generally work right, so after I'd come home from work, then I'd work on her till, you know, generally after midnight before I'd stop every day.
So you did the inside fitting work?
A lot of the inside fitting work, but all the deck work too, you know. There's the winch and the bowsprit and the mast and the spars. We had to shape all those up. Kath and I shaped all those up. And then we had our help with the rigging and all that stuff that Bobby Boyce made for us. And the sails, he had to make all the sails for us. Well, there was always a tremendous amount of work to do. There's no winches. There was nothing on the old boat. So she was all manhandled, you know. You really need 2 or 3 big Norwegians to handle her all the time. See, we moved around. We moved from Rosecutters Bay. We lived out in Double Bay a lot then, and then in Sailor Bay and Middle Harbour. And then finally we came down to Mossman Bay, which was great because we laid alongside Bert Colley's old boat shed, and he kept a very nice garden there. He won a gardening competition there with his little garden alongside the boat shed. There were no units or anything around there. It was very beautiful. They were all steam ferries, of course, in those days. And we could burst the boat in, the kids could get ashore, and there was a trams going up to the Mossman Junction, you know, and the kids had to get go straight up to school in trams. There was no worry. But we didn't have any fancy gear, nothing, see. We had no running water. We had a gravity tank over the sink where you'd pump the water from the main tanks, but there was no hot water. We had a bath, a sitting bath I had put in, and we had a bath once a week. We couldn't afford to do anything else. And it would always happen that Kath and little Maris would go in first to have the first bath. I used to heat the water up in a kerosene tin on primer stoves. It sounds primitive, and it was. And then I'd have my bath, and then young Mick would come in and say, "Oh, let's get the mud," you know. Yeah. Anyway, Kath kept a bright work. She had brass, all side lights, and running lights and stern lanterns, all oil lamps, brass oil lamps. The binnacle was also oil lamps on the binnacle, and down below it was all oil lamps. But they were beautiful, and all the portholes were brass, and they were all like gold. Kath kept that little boat looking like a jewel.
World War II prevented the Earls from sailing to the far-off tropical islands of Jack's boyhood dreams. But in December 1945, the Kathleen Gillet competed in the first Sydney to Hobart yacht race. This was a good sea trial for the boat, and in 1947, Jack Earl and his crew of 3 set off to circumnavigate the globe. It was the second Australian boat to do so. Kath and the children were passengers as far as Thursday Island and then returned home to Sydney to wait out the 18 months till Jack's return.
I remember the sails were made of flax, and the mainsail was so heavy we called it flexible plywood. It took 5 minutes to put a bin in, so it was very difficult for reefing when it got wet. Totally different to the present day, man-made fabrics with their Kevlar and all the exotic things they're making sails out of today with computers and so on.
It was a totally different type of enterprise where none of us had any money worth mentioning, least of all Jack. I think Jack had spent all his money on the boat and fitting out the boat, and he had a family to keep. At least all the rest of us were single, so that was a much easier task for us than it was for Jack.
We spent all the money we had all the time anyway. I borrowed £100 from some of my friends and left that with Kath and a few others to help us through while we were away. We could only afford to be away 18 months. There was no preparation apart from that, we just had to go.
When he set sail in Kathleen in 1947, he did so in a boat which would today not be certified to go to sea. The bureaucracy would not permit her to go. Why? Because she had no refrigeration, she had no electricity, she had an auxiliary engine which had to be started with a cartridge with an explosive charge. She had no navigation instruments other than those that Captain James Cook would have been familiar, a sextant and a rudimentary kind of compass. There was no radio, nothing. And there was no hydraulics, no winches. It was all block and tackle stuff. And the rig, this was something out of, the 19th century. I mean, we hadn't seen a vessel like that for a very long while.
I remember Kath Earl laid down dozens and dozens and dozens of eggs in water gel, wet gel, something I can't quite remember what they did, but I know they were greased and packed in salt, I think, from memory. It wasn't a great success, I'm afraid. But that was the sort of thing. We had rice and flour and things of that nature all packed in 4-gallon press-lid kerosene-type tins. Basic food.
Well, see, after the war you couldn't get stores. You got a lot of crummy stuff they were getting rid of too. And we found that the tinning on the inside, a lot of the tins, after we'd had them on board for 12 months, or the shaking around they were getting on the ship all the time, I think the tin used to affect the food. It was all wartime stuff. It wasn't very well done. And I think that made us a little bit crook, some of us. It wasn't too good. You could buy Australian butter in places like other places in the world. We even got Australian butter at Cocos Keeling. And we got it at Trinidad, but you couldn't get it here. We got a lot of bully beef and stuff like that. Took a lot of sour biscuits and tins of this and that. We took a lot of eggs too, and they all went bad in the Arafura Sea. Had to shut them out. I'd get breakfast, and I'd get the wheat mix out, and of course after a while I'd get fur on them, I'd get the mould on them, so you have to dust that off. Put them in the plates, little dishes. And then you get the powdered milk, and that's all hard, lumpy, so you mix that up and try and get as many lumps as you can out of it. And it's not a very attractive breakfast, Sometimes they wouldn't get out of bed to have it. When we got ashore, our friends would give us some nice meals. And, we didn't have very much on the boat, We
were fortunate because wherever we went, we were well received, and people invariably housed us and fed us and insisted, and then they'd give us gifts of fruit and vegetables and heavens only knows what when we were leaving. So, we did very well in this regard.
We were ruined when we went to Christmas Island for a start, one of our first stops up here south of Java. And then we went to Cocos and we got a wonderful deal there, wonderful time. And then on Rodrigues, little Rodrigues, a beautiful time we had there. And so had Mauritius. It just ruined us. We put the boat up on the slips and painted everything, people were helping. We'd stay at their homes and sail their boats. And it went on, goes on like that. To Durban was the same, Cape Town. We put the boat up on the slips at Cape Town. The Royal Cape Yacht Club painted the boat for us. All the ladies painted it. No, and so it's St. Helena. We stayed a month there, and we were guests at Government House, a great big stone mansion up on the top there. And Sir George Joy was the governor, and Lady Joy was his wife. And I had a choice of rooms. In mine, I chose the Admiral's room, which is as big as this studio, and a huge four-poster bed, and I had an easel to do my painting there. I did a lot of painting there. And then we had our breakfast upstairs. You'd put your sand shoes and so on, whatever you had on your feet, out by the door, and they'd be all polished up the next day, and all that sort of stuff. And we had dinner at night with them and with guests too down below, and it was all very formal, but very, very nicely done. You know, these lonely places there, and there were no people coming through there, and they'd see a lot of young fellas, and some of them were, you know, nice, bright young blokes I had with me, and they used to open their hearts for us. That was great.
The Kathleen arrived home safely in December 1948, and Jack sold his beloved boat in the early 1950s. It went to work around the Pacific Islands and in New Guinea. It's perhaps the dark period of the Kathleen Gillet's life. The interior was modified to accommodate a New Guinea crew, and eventually it was bought by Declan O'Donnell as an anchor ship for his crocodile shooting business.
The crew showed me everything in the beginning. They showed me everything. They even showed me how to shoot crocodiles. After I'd been out with them on the 8-month trip, I was surpassing them in my crocodile shooting. To make money, I used to average 2 crocodiles a night. All the ones from 12 feet down, we'd take them back to the ship complete, and they'd be hauled on the deck and left on the deck until next morning, and then we used to skin them. To skin a crocodile, it used to take us one person up to about 3/4 an hour to do it properly. The skins would be rolled up, flensed, all the flesh taken off the skins. They'd be rolled up to one side, and then we'd skin the others if we had others to do. And then when it was all done, we used to wash them in the salt water and then hang them up on the boom and let the salt water drain off them. And then the deck would be cleaned down with buckets of salt water, and then we just lay them flat on the deck of the ship and rub the salt into the skins there and just roll them up properly. And we had a special box behind the mainmast to put all the crocodile skins, but we had no real special areas at all. We just lived and slept with the crocodiles. I wanted to get into something faster, that I can move from point A to point B. From Sahano to Torokina, it used to be nearly a 12-hour trip if I had to use the engine alone on the Kathleen. And because I was getting away from crocodile shooting and it was getting harder and harder all the time to find them, I had to branch out into trading, and which included buying scrap brass, copra, and anything else that I could make money out of. I had to get something a bit faster and with a bit more capacity to carry cargo in. The Kathleen had too much draft, and she was very slow and rather cumbersome to move around generally.
This elegant boat was now a little run down, but in spite of this, caught the attention of Reg Stevenson, a businessman from Rabaul.
When I had it slipped, I found that the hull was still sound, and I had to replace the decks. They'd had it, and well, it had to have a total refit. The original plans of the boats had been lost. I couldn't contact Jack Earl. He was in America, and so we had to take out the sections, and Warwick Hood redrew the lines plans, and then we started from there. And I had a local chap who was supposed to be a shipwright, but he was a drunk, and I got him off the grog for a while and got him going on it, but he broke down finally, and Warwick's brother, Peter Hood, came up to do it for me. And it took them 2 years to rebuild it, to make a yacht out of it. I wanted a good seaworthy boat that I could go sailing with and could handle single-handed. So this was quite different from the original, and I couldn't possibly handle it single-handed with that gaff rig that was on it. So I had to get a new sail plan design for it and convert it into a Bermudan rig that I could handle. The gaff boom on that was 19 foot 6 long by 6 inches diameter. I mean, no normal one person could ever handle that.